Like always, please don't just believe me, don't just assume it's true, because I say so. Search the scriptures, and let the Bible be your authority. The name James is a Greek name. The Hebrew name for James is Yaakov, Jacob. So anybody who's named James, or Jimmy, or Jimbo, or whatever, is originally Jacob. That's at least the Hebrew originally of it, Yaakov. Jaime, a lot of those names, they all come from this. In the New Testament, obviously you won't find then James in the Old Testament, because if a guy's named James in the Old Testament, he's named Jacob. In the New Testament, what you're going to find are there are two predominant guys named James. The one that gets the most press, and then this guy. The guy that gets the most press, we know that because he's listed throughout the four Gospels. His name's James. He happens to be the brother of John, and they're called the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder. He's a fisherman. He is also one of the inner three, if you will, Peter, James, and John. I mean, if you think about it, Jesus sent out this, he started with a big, massive disciple, sends out 70, after he sends out 12, and then he winds up even from that down to 3 when he goes to pray. But there at the cross, he's got one guy standing in front of him, and that's John, that he actually gives responsibility to his mother to. Consider that when we think about the second guy. What we know about this James, this first James, is that he doesn't make it very long. Though he was part of the inner three, and we could talk about whether it was because Jesus saw great potential in them or whatever. I'll be honest, I taught secondary school for years. The guys you spend the most time with are normally not the ones that have the most potential, or they could. They're just the ones that need the most attention. And when you realize Peter, James, and John, you would kind of go, yeah, this is what we might call the remedial class. I mean, you've got Peter, who, says no, Lord, on more than one occasion, thrice on 2 different occasions, if you will. And then with that, you have James and John, who wanted to call fire down from heaven on an entire city that didn't let him through in Samaria, because they wouldn't let him through in passage, because they were on their way to Jerusalem. You can see Jesus going, oh, you guys need some extra help here. Nonetheless, what we do know about this particular James is by the time we get to Acts chapter 12, is that Herod, at the time Agrippa, is obviously seeking to appease the people, and he actually beheads James. So James, John's brother, will actually be not the first Christian martyr, because we could say Stephen is in chapter 7, but he's the first of the 12 disciples, well, the first of the 11. We're going to remove Judas from that. The first of the 11 to die. And he is killed publicly, and it tends to, by the way, fare really well with the religious leaders. So the guy that writes this particular letter can't be that guy, because he's already dead, and that would actually be its own weird supernatural event for him to rise to write something. Then there's the second guy. The second guy happens to be Jesus' half-brother. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus is speaking at the synagogue in Nazareth. Jesus will talk about a prophet is never without honor except in his own hometown, in his own house. And as he's there, the people are familiar with him. They watched him grow up. I mean, even if a kid seems to be perfect, you just assume he's more of a brat at home by himself. So when he begins to speak and then pulls out of Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, in Isaiah 61, and then he says, now in your hearing, this is fulfilled today, they turn around and they're offended. And they're like, who does this guy think he is? Isn't this the carpenter's son, as it's written in Matthew 13:55? And is not his mother called Mary? It's interesting, the carpenter's son. Why did they call him Joseph? And it says, and his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. And so it actually says, and his sisters, we'll read, so he has at least 2 sisters. That means he has at least a 6-pack of siblings, which, by the way, makes it even weirder, of course, when you start playing the Virgin Mary card, because there's 2 really weird answers to that. One is that Mary continued to get her virginity, and forgive me for even saying that, but it just, you're just really pushing it. Or Joseph had these from a previous marriage. The problem is they're always listed younger than Jesus. And they're usually listed in the order of age. Which, by the way, if that's the case, listen, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Who is the oldest of those 4? James is. Who is the youngest of those 4? Judas. Important to note. I'll tell you why in a moment. Now, in John chapter 5, Jesus is, there is a feast. John focuses around the feast. And his brothers actually say to Jesus, why don't you come down right now? Well, nobody that wants to be a celebrity does this stuff privately. Go down there and show yourself off. Loose paraphrase. Don't just believe me, John 7. And Jesus looks and he says, for anyone like yourself, any time is right, but my time isn't right. This isn't my time. Do you know there was a head of Scotland Yard here in this country, because that's where Scotland Yard is, named Richard Anderson, who became knighted, who was a detective, who took the Daniel 9 prophecy from the going forth of the command to rebuild Jerusalem to the day of Mashiach, Nagi, the Messiah, the Prince, it will be, and he starts doing the math on this 7-year period, 880,000 days. So he starts doing the math, and as he starts doing the math on this, he gets to the day that we know is exactly the day of Palm Sunday. It's one of the things that helps him actually completely surrender his life to Christ, as he realizes that math could only work out for one individual. No Messiah could show up on any other day but that day, according to Daniel. So when Jesus says, my day hasn't come yet, he has a specific day to fulfill. Daniel's been telling us about it, nonetheless. But in that conversation, and Jesus is in essence rebuking his brothers, because they're chiding them, it does say this in John 7, verse 5, that even his brothers did not believe in him. So you're in a position where you've got 4 younger brothers. Any of you have 4 younger brothers? Be a good time for Shamar. That's rough enough. But you've got 4 younger brothers who obviously are looking, going, what, you're like the Messiah? My big brother is delusional, right? And I'll tell you how bad it gets. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus is now not eating and sleeping like a normal person would. He's in essence, what we would say is he's working himself to death. And we read in Mark 3:21 that when his own people heard about this, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. Do you know what we would call that today? An intervention. Do you know what an intervention is, right? Where somebody's destroying their life, and those closest to them come in and go, we love you, but we are concerned, right? And you're like, all right. Who are his own people that have said, he's lost it? He's gone nuts. Imagine. Well, in Mark 3, 10 verses later, then his brothers and his mother came standing outside calling for him. Do you know who his own people were? His family. His own family looked, including mom. Let me remind you, mom, star, angel, wise men, shepherds, lots of kind of crazy moments, younger and things. It's not a lot of that happening right now. They're like, he's going to kill himself. If he keeps this up, we better go. And they go to get him. And this is what Jesus does to allay their fears. So, the multitude was sitting around Jesus, and Jesus says, they said to him, look, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered and said, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And he looked around the circle at those who were upset about him, and he said, here's my mother and my brothers. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think this would actually make his family go, oh, he's clearly saying now. But it's like, look, here they are. Whoever does the will of God is my mother, my brother, my sister's my mother. But I'd have to say that had to register with James. Remember, his brothers are outside, and Jesus goes, that's not my brothers. You guys are my brothers. And what would that be like for James? Somebody of the brothers had to make fun of him back in John 7. Oh, come on, you should just go there and do this. I find that interesting. At the cross, why did Jesus hand the responsibility of his mother over to John? Because he'd rather have John, a believer, watching mom, than any of his brothers who weren't. That's the simplest truth of it. at the cross, we read this. In Matthew 27:56, among those who were at the cross were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph. Who's that, by the way? Who's the mother of James and Joseph? It's Jesus' mom. Remember how his two older brothers were James and Joseph? Mary was there, and we read that Mary was there, and she's called there the mother of those two older brothers. In Mark's account of that, in Mark 15:40, it says, there were women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene. Notice she's mentioned first again. Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, Solomon. In that case, this Jesus' brother, James, is given a nickname, James the Lesser. Which one of you wants that name? You know, it's little Lois. There's a big Lois. She's the lesser Lois. That kind of thing. The good news is you're the first Lois, you know, so the next one has to be the lesser. So James the Less is traditionally the nickname then for Jesus's, dare I say, half-brother. Same mom, different dad, if you will, in that. Jesus has a special relationship with this guy, and I remind you, once Jesus passes off the scene in regards to being the son of the family, he's the man of the house. We don't have any record of Joseph, basically, after that age 12 incident. If you remember when Jesus, in essence, is bar mitzvah, and they go and they leave him, they accidentally do. After that event, we have no record of Joseph from that point on. It says in 1 Corinthians 15, when it talks about the gospel, it says he died for our sins according to Scripture, was buried, on the third day rose again according to Scripture, and then was seen by a lot of people. And it says in that, it says that he was seen, after that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. This James clearly has to be James the Less, because the other James was one of the apostles. Somewhere after the resurrection, he becomes a believer. But he becomes more than just a believer. Jesus' half-brother becomes one of the heads, one of the pillars of the church in Jerusalem. So much so that when Paul gets converted, he goes to Jerusalem and he says he saw Peter and he saw James, the Lord's brother. I guess that's pretty clear who that guy is. But when he has that showdown in Acts 15 about whether Gentiles could be saved, and if so, do we lay upon them the heavy trip of Moses, the 613 laws of Moses, and so forth, the person who puts the final answer on it is James, Jesus' half-brother. He appears to be the guy that's sort of the guy in charge there, as much as anyone is, for what it's worth. James is, in the simplest sense, a very, call it like it is, straightforward, not a lot of fancy talk kind of guy. Some people like that. Some people would rather have it a little bit more ornamented. It's sort of like, some people, it's like, you know what, I'd rather not drink a whole cup of this medicine. Just give me the bitter nastiness and a little spoon and I'll drink it. Well, he's the medicine in the spoon. Now his brother, remember his youngest brother's name? Judas. Judas, on the other hand, is a lot more flowery. Judas also writes a letter. And that letter is the letter of Jude, the one right before the book of Revelation. And he calls himself, for what it's worth, Jude, the brother of James. Kind of had sort of a simple math to put that together. But listen to some of the statements he makes, Jude. When he calls the people who are false prophets, false teachers, he calls them clouds without water, autumn trees, raging waves, wandering stars. I kind of see this guy hanging out barefoot in a coffee house somewhere, maybe with a little bit of beard wax and a flannel. I mean, granted, he's going to be, he's a guy that's a little bit more flowery in the way that he presents things. They'll both use metaphors, but he's obviously a little bit more colorful with his metaphors. James, on the other hand, he's going to say, adulterers and adulteresses, foolish man, you're fattening yourself for the slaughter. That's the way James talks to you. And I kind of get his brother would be like, oh, big bro, mellow out, man. Come on, you need to be a little more cool about things, Season it up with a little bit of, hi, how's it going? None of that from James. Matter of fact, one of the first things we'll learn about James is he gives no captatio benevolentiae. Now, if you remember, for some of you know that when you approach sort of a noble person, you start by saying something nice about them. Every time in the book of Acts that Paul has to give his defense, he'll start by going, be it that you know the traditions of the Jews, I more happily approach you. That's called captatio benevolentiae. He does it in almost all of his letters. He's like, every time I think about you, I can't stop praying for you. I'm so excited about you when I remember your love for all the saints. It's captatio benevolentiae. Does that make sense? James goes, James, to you guys, greetings. And then he goes in. That's all you get from him. James is not being like, hey, you guys, let's all hug, dudes. I love you, man. But James, and it's only roughly, I think it's 102 verses, 104 verses, 108 verses, if I remember correctly. There are over 50 commands in this book. And that's why this book, in its simplest sense, is for the most part just going to teach itself. It's going to go, do this, and stop doing this. And you should do this. Oh, and this thing, don't do that. But the word brethren or brothers in these 5 chapters, 108 verses, is used 19 times. 20 times when you actually bring in other words like brother. Apparently, remember when he's got to hear Jesus go, who are my brothers? It's you guys. Somewhere in all of that, James is like, yeah, okay. And he bites into that enough to be able to call it. And he'll call them beloved brothers, my beloved brothers. So he still has a soft spot somewhere in it. But he'd be like, my beloved brothers, you foolish guy. I mean, he still doesn't have a problem telling you what he thinks. So, in the simplest sense, this is what the book's about. And this is why this book is so ridiculously pertinent. And this is why this book was hated by Martin Luther. He called it an epistle of straw. Hated this book. Because Martin Luther's whole point was, the church was basically saying, you're saved by works. And Martin Luther's going, no, you're saved by grace. Who's right? Martin Luther is right. You're saved by grace. God gives you the gift. You can never earn the gift. God has to give it to you. Then he reads this and he goes, faith plus works. And he goes, what? This defeats everything I've been saying. It actually doesn't. The problem is the word works, we've turned into a Christian term. The word works, ergos, simply means action. Matter of fact, the word energy, ergos, literally means in action in the Greek. So it isn't going faith plus these sacraments, because then we think that could be the works, or faith plus being an altar boy, that's the works. It's faith that does something. So here's the problem James is facing. James is looking at a group of people that say, I'm a Christian. And he goes, so what does that look like, man? How has that changed you? Because if you just say you're a Christian and it doesn't do anything, I don't believe you. That's what James is saying. So, I mean, you got to love a guy like that. And if it makes you kind of question, then my prayer tonight is then it's like, God, then change me enough so that I see the change. He's like, you say that God is one? Even the demons know that much, and they shudder. Do you know what he says? You know what he's saying is? The demons believe that enough that this is what it makes them do. It makes them shudder. You believe it, and what did it make you do? Nothing? Okay, not buying it. Do you see what I'm saying? So the whole idea of faith and works is not faith plus works saves you. It's that faith, there's your version of faith, which is you believe in God, but it doesn't do anything, which I call dead, James speaking. And then there's a faith that makes you do stuff. And that faith that makes you do stuff is a living faith. That saves you. So it isn't about faith plus works, it's about a faith that works. Does that make sense? So he goes, basically here's 2 basic things, and then again, what we'll do is we'll break chocolate, and then we'll just read through it. I'll develop a little bit at the beginning, and then, for the most part, we'll just read through 5 chapters and lick our wounds when we're done. We'll have to point out a few things in the light of it, but for the most part, it's just a simple book, so it teaches itself. And why teach what is already being taught? One thing, rich people, if you've given your life to Christ and he really has changed you, how do you view riches now? He goes, it should be different. And you'll find it's a radical thing in this book. Personal favoritism. Why are you playing up to that guy? That guy's rich, he doesn't believe in God, and he's suing Christians, and you want to buddy up with that guy. He goes, you know, that doesn't look like a saved person to me, James speaking. Now, he's not saying a rich person, you should hate him. But he's going, if you are still, in other words, imagine putting James in a name it, claim it church. I think he'd grab a whip and just start beating people. He'd be like, yeah, I'm saved, get out of here. I mean, he doesn't have a problem telling you. But the other thing is your tongue. In other words, he goes, let me just say it this way. If you've given your life to Jesus, it should change your priorities, and it should change the way you talk. And what you'll find is there are over 80 different references in one way or another that directly address the issue of your tongue in this book. He'll say, like, for instance, and it won't be, you know, like, you ever hear a mother that's like, use your words, honey, use your words. He's like, yes, use your words. Like, think about this. He goes, if anyone's sick, what should a person do if they're sick? Does anyone remember, according to James? Yeah, let them call out for the elders, right? If anyone's grieving, what should they do? They should pray. If anyone's happy, what should they do? Sing songs. What happened in all three of those cases? Whatever's happening inside should lead to something verbal. See what I'm saying? Use your words, honey. Right? That's the idea here. He goes, but with that same mouth you curse brothers? He goes, now how is that Christian? Does that make sense? So that's kind of the point he starts living. He goes, so worldly wisdom, what he'll find is the world's wisdom is, check out how smart I am. And he goes, that's just stupid. He goes, godly wisdom looks like this. Sown in peace by those who make peace. Godly religion, help the helpless and keep yourself unspotted. Every good and perfect gift comes from. And by the way, the biggest things I will try to develop are the verses that are most commonly quoted from this book that we quote out of the context of it. Now, understand there are times where you could take the verse and go, clearly this applies to a lot of things, but you never want to lose the context first for it. Like, for instance, submit yourself to God, resist the devil, and he will what? He will flee. Okay, we know the verse. What's the context for that? That's a classic example. We're like, well, the example is submit to God, right? I mean, submit to God, resist the devil, and he's got to run away. Actually, there's a context to it. It's kind of fun to look at. All right. Any questions in regards to our intro? I'll develop just the first verse, and then we'll start handing it around. Be sensitive to where you start seeing things verbal. Be sensitive to where he says brethren, for instance. How often you'll see that. And, yeah. I mean, think of things like let him ask, let him say, don't say, speak, those kind of things. Okay. First verse says, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. Quick moment. Notice again, we've moved away from location spots. You know, Rome, Corinth, Galatia, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, Thessalonica. We've moved now to 12 tribes scattered abroad. In 2 Kings 24 and 25, you may be aware of, the 12 tribes were conquered, the 10 tribes of the north, at that time called Israel, were conquered in 722 BC by the Assyrian army. As they were conquered by the Assyrian army, the majority of the Jewish people were deported out of that area, and other people were brought in their place. The capital of the Northern Empire at that time was Samaria, and that's where we get the term Samaritan from. We can talk about that. There was much more than this that they actually had to intermingle, so that means they were mixed race. It was much more than they were just not purebred Jew. But it was the primary thing, it's a very fundamental thing, is that once that happened, lions came into the community and started mauling people, and they went like, we've angered their God. And remember, they thought gods were territorial. So they're like, the God of this area is pretty upset. We need to go find a priest that could teach us how to do, and the term is the rituals. And it's rituals. So they find a priest. He's like, what rituals do we do? Teaches them the rituals. They do the rituals. The lions go away. They're like, boom, fine. So we know how to do the rituals. And that's the problem. Please understand, the biggest difference between being a Christian and I challenge you to find it in other religions is other religions will worship their God to keep them away. And that's exactly what the Samaritans were doing. They were worshiping, or if you will, they were doing the rituals to keep lions away. They weren't seeking the Lord. So that's one of the reasons they were hated by the people who considered themselves purebreds from the south. But what had happened is that, so they were scattered from that. Then in 166, 167 BC, you have Antiochus Epiphanes, who thinks he's God incarnate, who now is going to come in and demand everyone bow to him. And when he started coming in from the Grecian Empire, people scattered again. People fled. This time, they, instead of going east to Iran and Iraq, now they went north to Turkey. So you have that dispersion. And they call that the diaspora, which you'll find later. Diaspora means the dispersion. Then you have Herod the Great, who wasn't so great in regards to his personality. He wasn't so great at all. As a matter of fact, he looked kind of like a little fat bald guy. But he was brilliant in his building, but he was terrible otherwise. But remember when he killed all of those children, fearful of the Messiah, again, people start fleeing. So you have three different times, in essence, where you have the Jewish people leaving Israel. And so what Peter is doing, what James is doing is he's writing to people. This is a letter that's to be handed over a 1,500-mile circumference, or radius, I should say. Because you're going all the way up into Turkey and you're going all the way east into Iran and Iraq. That's an awful lot of territory for him to send this out to. So, for what's worth. So, at least so you understand that. Okay, let's start diving in. Verse 2.
My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials,
knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience.
But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing.
Okay, notice, by the way, that perfect word. Remember the word perfect? Most of you are familiar now. The word's teleos, and it means to go to its proper completion. We often use the reference of a bus, and it says this is where it terminates. Where it terminates, it's completed. But I might consider, in a case like this, using the reference of, let's use this, Viola for a moment. Viola, becoming a pharmacist, has to take specific classes. And there are some that she's going to have to take to fulfill a certain amount of requirements, of amounts of units, but there are required classes. And if she doesn't pass that required class, Viola is not going to be able to graduate. When she graduates, she has been perfected in this sense. She has reached the intended end of that particular branch of schooling. Is that fair to say? And the same way, what he says is that these trials are necessary. This is not an elective. This is a required class, and you will not graduate without going through these particular trials. That is imperative. That's the kind of idea here. Fun place for him to start.
If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him.
But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the winds.
For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord.
He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways.
How's that for a very lovely? He's like, if you just ask God for wisdom, he'll not only give it to you, he'll give you more than you need. And he actually won't chide you for it. Now, let's make something clear here. Knowledge, wisdom. Knowledge is information. Wisdom is what to do with it. You could be very aware of a screwdriver. You could know that in the end of it all, you put it in a screw, you turn it, it works. That's knowledge. Well, and a little bit of wisdom. In the end of it all, you could take that thing and go, I think it'd actually be better hammering, pounding in nails. That's now an improper application to the knowledge. Wisdom is not knowledge. Wisdom is what to do with it. So, here's a situation. Now, I remind you, what is the context of this? When he said about asking for wisdom, what was the thing prior? Trials. It was about trials. It's like, so you're in a trial, and you're like, I don't think I need any more information. I just don't know what the heck to do. Great place to start. That's our context. And he goes, you know what you do? Ask God and expect him to answer. But if you ask and you're wishy-washy, I don't know if God's going to really answer or not. He goes, you're not demonstrating faith. Remember the whole thing is calling yourself a Christian? It's like a Christian should trust God to respond. He goes, that guy, he's double-minded. By the way, the word there's for it's just dupsuke, like suke, like psychology. It's your mind. Like duplas means double. He's got two brains going on at the same time. They're heading in two different directions. And he goes, that guy shouldn't expect to hear an answer from God because he's already busy thinking about how he's going to... You ever do this? God, I need to figure out the answer. Give me wisdom. And then you start trying to solve the problem yourself without waiting for him to answer it. And then you're like, God, why am I in this mess? He's like, could you never stop to listen to what I had to say? All right. Now let's move into that view of the rich thing. We're going to find it a few times. Verse 9.
Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation,
but the rich in his humiliation. Because as a flower of the field, he will pass away.
For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat, than it withers the grass, its flowers fall, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits.
The moment you give your life to Christ, he opens you up to the concept of eternity. Everything changes. Because then you see some rich guy that seems right now like he's completely stable, he's well seated, everything seems to be easy for him. And he goes, let the guy who's poor right now glory. He's actually the exalted one, because the other guy, everything that he has is temporary. He goes, man, he has his day. He's having his day right now in front of you, but the sun's going to rise, and it's going to be like, it's all gone. You can't take it with him. You should actually celebrate the fact you don't have anything to lose. Because everything you have that's important, you get to take with you. The only thing I want to take to heaven is you guys, is my family. I mean, there's no guitar or piano or anything. And I'm like, oh, there's no collection. Anyways, verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures temptation. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him.
Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone.
But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed.
Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death.
You do see there that there's a process. It starts with desire. Desire, by the way, is not sin. It connects with your will. Temptation, by the way, Jesus was tempted in every way, yet without sin. That tells me temptation isn't sin. The question is, are you going to let it, and the example he uses, and I'll try to say this carefully, is conception. Two things have to meet. They both can exist, but until those two things meet, there's no baby. And he goes, here's the two things. Temptation, your will. If those two things don't meet, there's no baby. But once they start to conceive, what's the baby according to this? Sin. And what is that when it grows up fully? What does it become? Death. Yeah, it'd be good not to have that. But look at the verses 16 through 18 because it's in comparison to that. Verse 16.
Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren.
Every good and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning.
Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruit of his creatures.
So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath.
The wrath of God does not produce the righteousness of God, or the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
Therefore, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls.
But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves.
If anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, it's like a man observing his natural face in the mirror.
For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was.
But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the word, this one will be blessed in what he does.
Okay. Let me ask you a question now. Read this carefully. There's an illustration. A man looks in the mirror, he sees who he is, and then he walks away and forgets what kind of man he is. What kind of man he is? And there is a term here, it talks about, don't just hear the word, do it. But then he gives us a specific title or description of the word. What does he call the word in here?
The perfect law of liberty.
Beautiful. Don't miss this. Because it says, he who looks into, so that's the mirror. The mirror that shows him what kind of man he is. Twice in this book, it's going to use this same term. If this is the term I'm drawing from, that James is using to show me who I am, when I look in there and I see myself and I walk away and forget, do you know what kind of man I am when I look there? According to this term, it's exactly it. He's free. You look into that mirror and you do what he says. You remember that you are walking in the law of eleutheria, freedom. Because he walks away, you forget you're free. You don't want that. All right, verse 26.
If anyone among you thinks he is religious, and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless.
Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world.
So they say, help the helpless, stay unpolluted. Because that's good religion.
My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality.
For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes,
and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and say to him, you sit here in a good place, and say to the poor man, you stand there, or sit here at my footstool.
Have you not shown your partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?
Listen, my beloved brethren, has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him?
But you have dishonoured the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into courts?
Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you were called?
If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. You do well.
But if you show partiality, you commit sin, and are convicted by the law as transgressors.
For whoever shall keep the whole law, and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all.
For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law.
So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty.
It was our second mention of that.
For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
Have you ever seen one of those churches where they have big tither seats? I have. It's like one of the craziest things. It's like everybody sits back here, but there are like 5 people that are, they call them like champions, right? They're like 1,000-pound champions or 10,000-pound champions. And they sit up there with the speaker. And they're like, so everyone can kind of see that. And I read this text and I'm like, how could you read this text once and go, oh yeah, that totally works. You know, it's just, and I'm like, you just kind of like, it would have been really great to see James walk in there just once and see what he would have to say. James, you want to lead us in prayer? Yes, I do. You know, but it's like, but we might not do that with somebody that's just completely wealthy like that, but we might do it with someone that's a sports star or the person who wins the bake-off. I mean, whatever it is, right? I mean, it's amazing how we can adulate unsaved people and the kind of questionable thing that looks like on the side of that. And if they were to walk into church, it's like, oh, if we could just get that person to say, you know. All right. All right, James, go for the throat. Verse 14, is it me?
What does it profit, brethren? If someone says he has faith, but does not have works, can faith save him?
If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food,
And one of you says to them, "Depart in peace, be warm and filled," or you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit?
That's also faith by itself. If it does not have works, is dead.
Now, I want to say something challenging that may hit a nerve, so good. Who's the person in need according to this? Brother or sister. What does that mean? The Christian. Do you know God actually tells us where to show preferential treatment to the saved? He says, let us do good to all, but especially to the household of faith. And there's a specific reason for that. God wants the world to see us function as a family in such a way that they want to be a part of it. If they see us infighting, backbiting, and gossip, and sort of spin doctoring, why in the world would they want to be a part of it? And he goes, somebody that's a saved person, again, it's like we could focus on trying to reach the lost, and we should preach the gospel. But we should also make sure, think about all the spiritual gifts that are listed in Scripture. How many of them are to the lost? Yeah, you have evangelism, arguably prophecy in some cases, or I might say word of knowledge. But in that, every other one's to the church. It's like there should be, every saved person should come to realize that God wants to use them, and the place that they're to be used first and foremost is among the family. I mean, we're all called to go and preach the gospel. Some will be very gifted at it, some will not be as gifted, but we're all called to minister to the body too. So that's just fun. And again, he goes, I just want to remember when Jesus separates the sheep and goats? And of course he's like, I was naked and you fed me. I was naked and you fed me. Well, that'd be weird. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was sick and you attended to me. I was in prison and you visited me. And they're like, oh, when did we do that? I didn't recognize it was you. Remember what he said? When you've done this to the least of these, my brothers. And again, the point is not to neglect the world. The point is to not neglect the body. And often that we can. We could be all about protesting and making sure nobody's killing a harp seal and all those things. And again, I'm not saying those things are bad. They're just not the thing. And then we neglect the family. Hey, you could see that. If a father neglected his family to go and do other things, it would still be tragic for the family because the family only has one father. And family, the body of Christ only has one you. And you may not feel that special, but you certainly are to God. And he placed you in a place where you have the opportunity to demonstrate that. All right, I'll move forward. All right, verse 18. I think it's me. But someone will say, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. In other words, I'll show you my faith by my actions.
You believe that there is one God. You do well. Even the demons believe and tremble.
But do you want to know, O foolish men, that faith without works is dead?
Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar?
So you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect.
Remember that perfect, just take it to its proper end.
And the scripture was fulfilled which says, Abraham believed God and it was appointed to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God.
We see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only.
Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way?
For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also.
Who are the two characters that are demonstrated here, that are brought before us? Abraham and Rahab. Okay. Some of you remember last week when we went through Hebrews? What's the verb? Abraham believed God and it made him do something. What did it make him do? Just give me the verb.
Obey?
Oh, look, according to this.
Oh.
Yeah. He offered. And what he offered was, he offered Isaac nonetheless. How about this one? Rahab the harlot, the woman. She received. Does that sound familiar from those of you with Hebrews? Every girl, remember, received. And remember, as the bride of Christ, I think it's just kind of a cool thing. The first thing we do in our act of faith is receive. We receive the gift of Jesus Christ. We receive his love. We receive his payment. I just think it's just a way cool thing. All right, anyways, chapter 3.
My brethren, let not many of you become teachings, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment.
For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body.
Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths and that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body.
Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder whenever the pilot decides, wherever the pilot goes.
Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles.
And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body, and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell.
For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind.
But no man can tame the tongue. It is truly an unruly evil, full of deadly poison.
With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God.
Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so.
Does a spring send forth fresh water, and bitter from the same opening?
Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh.
Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom.
If you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth.
This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic.
For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there.
But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy.
Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members?
You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask.
You ask and do not receive, because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures.
Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God.
Guys, can you just read that verse to yourself once? That's one of the hardest pills to swallow.
Or do you think that the scripture says in vain, the spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously?
But he gives more grace, therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Okay, I'm asking, what's the context? What are we resisting the devil? What is he trying to get us to do?
Friends of the world.
Yes, befriend the world. That's the context of this. He's going, you can't befriend the world and love God. No. That's an infinitely heavier and different verse now, isn't it? If I submit to God, what am I doing? If I'm submitting to him, obviously, he's telling me to do something and I have to be willing to concede. Can I dare say, submission isn't submission until you disagree. Because if someone said, hey, I just want to give you a tenner, you're like, I can submit to that. Right? Submission, to choose to rank yourself under, means you have a desire, they have a desire, they have the final say. Jesus gave us the greatest example of that in the garden when he said, Father, if there be any other way, let this cup pass from before me, but not my will, yours be done. The perfect, I hate to use the word mantra because that's Eastern, but sort of the slogan for submission is not my will, but yours be done. To submit to God, what do I want to do that God tells me not to? Befriend the world. I want the world to love me. I want the world to adore me. And I want to shape myself to be very tasty and easily liked by the world. And he goes, you realize befriending the world that's declared war against me is making yourself an enemy of me. Do you really want to do that? God says, I know you want to do this. I wouldn't tell you to submit to me unless I knew you did, that you wanted to do this, and I'm telling you not to. But I want you to know, you need to submit to me. But to submit to me, you're going to need to resist the devil. Which tells me that to resist the devil, and it is to resist and keep resisting the devil. It isn't like, I resisted him once he's running. This is a commitment to resist on this. Because it is let's face it, which one of us has any inkling inside ourselves at all that oh yeah, this is a great idea? What does he call them here? Adulterers and adulteresses. There is no worse term to use than that. All right. But this is what you could have instead, verse 8. Because the idea is, well, if I befriend the world, I'm going to be lonely. Look at verse 8.
Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded.
Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom.
Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up.
Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the Lord of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge.
There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who are you to judge another?
Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit.
Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? Is it even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away?
Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that.
But now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil.
Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin.
By the way, I love how you're engaging your brains tonight. I mean, it just really, really blesses me, and I got to do it again. Therefore, verse 17, therefore, you always say, if there's a therefore, you want to make sure to find out what the therefore is there for. It's a bridge between a concept normally and an application. The conclusion is, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. How does that apply to what he just said in verses 13 to 16? How do you put that together with the therefore? How does those two things fit together?
If you sort of arrogantly plan your life, you know that that's not good, and therefore it's sin. Like it's actually wrong.
Okay, I agree with you.
Is
totally.
that what you mean?
Well, okay, so you have that at the beginning, right? You're like, you can't just go, well, I'm going to go and do this next year. I'm going to just do this and this and this. And you go, well, there's nothing wrong with having a plan, right? And you're like, I'm kind of planned it out, but God, if you want that to happen, we're cool. The question is, how do we connect that with this statement? To him who knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him it's a sin. How do you put those two things together?
If the Lord speaks to you about something specifically, and you go against that?
And how would you go against it? Contextually.
Through rebellion, to do the opposite of what God...
I dare add this, if I could. You do it through procrastination. God says, Frank, I have this I want you to do. And you're like, this year I'm going to go to this place, I'm going to go and do this business, I'm going to go this and this and this, and then I'll do that. Do you see what? Because the idea of it is, if you know to do good, but you don't do it, why aren't you doing it? Because I already have a plan. You know what? I'll do it at the end of it. He goes, you realize how arrogant you sound? God says, I need you to do this, or I want you to do this, and you're like, yeah, but I have this plan. I'll tell you what, I'll do it at the end of it. And the idea of it, does that make sense how those two things correlate? In other words, he's kind of going, when God says do something, make it the first thing. Put it in the to-do list as the first thing. There's an illustration we used to do where we'd have this glass jar. Kind of like, kind of like the whole like granola and those kind of things in it, like this. And there was rice, and there was walnuts. The walnuts are the things that God tells you to do, to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. The rice are all those little things that have to get done every day. You have to wash your clothes. That's kind of good. Brush your teeth. Yeah, that's good too. You know, there are things, oh, well, you know, it's rubbish day tomorrow. I better make sure I get the bags out. Okay, there's things that have to be done. I should probably call my friend. You know, while we're at it, I should make sure I renew my subscription to Netflix. Whatever those things are. Maybe I should find out who actually won last, who got disqualified from the bake-off. Whatever those things are. Those are rice. But what you've learned is if you put the rice in first, you can't fit all the walnuts. But if you put the walnuts in first, the rice have their way of making their way around it. But if your rice is the plan you've made for your life and God says, let me completely change that. So you kind of just walk in and God like does a Tesla on you. You know, they say the Teslas have this amazing turning capacity where you're just kind of sitting there and you're like, you're kind of against the wall because it just turns hard. So you're just kind of sitting there and you're like, this is the plan. We're going to come back. And when we come back, this is our plan. And this is what we're going to do. And here's the 5-year thing. And it's like, okay, I kind of get it. And we're going to see these guys raise up. We're going to do this and this. And God goes, and he pulls you out and he goes, this is what I have for you. And you're like, when? He's like, how much of this still fits? And I tend to use the term, all right, that's the walnut. Tend to the walnut. Let the rice fall where it needs to. Does that make sense? I just want us to be bright enough because we could take these two statements and separate them and they're still great statements. You know, look at you make plans, but in the end of it all, don't be arrogant to say, God, get behind my plan. This is my dream. You say, all right, God, if this is what you know what's best for me and you love me more than I love me, if you will, make this happen. But then and if I know how to do good and I'm not doing it, well, then that's sin, clearly. But when I put the two together, I realize this is one of the ways that I could actually kind of technically do it. Well, I'm still going to get it done, but it never gets done. And God's like, you really need to realize that procrastination's still a sin. All right, we're in our last chapter. And by the way, notice that mourn. Remember when Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn? Does that make any sense? I'm like, how are you happy when you're mourning? And I challenge you to take a look at the list in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. What you'll find is there's an order from someone who becomes conscious of their sin. They become poor in spirit and they start to mourn over their sin. And it leads them to a place to seek to become hungry for righteousness. They're like, God, I want to get right. And they get dealt with. And by the time they're done with it, they're pure in heart. And I love the fact that the idea of it is you become aware of what's wrong. And then you take it to Christ and you get it made right. He's not just telling you permanently mourn over these things. He's like, mourn over the fact. He's like, you know what? Can I just say it this way? Stop being numb about the stuff that's killing you. Stop being numb about your worldliness. And I'm talking to me. And stop being numb about your indifference, about the way that God wants to use you, or the way that you're not wanting to listen, or your rebellion that we're playing off as, I'm not really listening. I have teen daughters. I know what it's like when they're pretending like they're not listening to me, but it's just flat out rebellion, and I know it. But they're like, I didn't really hear you. Yeah, you did. He's like, the idea of this is, could you feel again, what would it be like if I actually let your conscience win? There was a girl who has had a terrible drinking problem. She was a complete alcoholic before she came to Christ. And she came to Christ, and God, like this, removed her desire for drink and her desire to smoke. I didn't even ask what. And then she started hanging out with a group of Christians and started drinking again. But it was always kind of like, this doesn't feel right. Now look at, the point was, and this is what I was saying, is the point was not to convert everyone to not drink. The point was to convert them to their conscience, if that makes sense. And for her, it was always like, this isn't right. You know, I'm like, look, I was an addict. Why am I playing with this? But it was like kind of weird not to in her group. And this last week, she was at one of the studies a couple weeks ago, and she's just like, God's like, you know what you're supposed to do. Now, remember, conviction's a personal thing. And she's like, this is your thing. And she has since walked away from it, and I'm so proud of her for. But it's like if you actually let your conscience speak, the Holy Spirit speak through your conscience, would there be in your ear like, all right, I'm done. I am not listening anymore, because that's the idea of this, man. What would it be like to have that pure conscience to go, God, if you're telling me stay away from them, staying away. If you're like it's cool, I'm going to be cool with it. That's where he's with this. I like James for that. Okay, last chapter. Verse 1. It's probably me.
Don't sin.
You notice that he started by my brothers, my beloved brothers, my beloveds, and then he was like, come now. Last chapter, come now, you rich. Weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you.
Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten.
Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days.
Indeed, the wages of the labourers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath.
You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter.
You have condemned and you have murdered the just. He does not resist you.
Therefore, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain.
You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand.
Do not grumble against one another, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door.
My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience.
Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful.
But above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment.
Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms.
Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord.
And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven.
Confess your trespasses to one another, and pray for one another, that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much.
Use your words.
Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months.
And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit.
Why do you think it was so important that we're told that Elijah was a man with a nature like ours?
So I feel like he's someone special and we can't pray him.
It's exactly. It's like when you go, well, it's Elijah, right? Well, that guy prayed and it wouldn't rain. Of course, it was Elijah. He's like, dude, he was just like you. Struggled just like you. By the way, beautiful study in the book in regards to in 1 Kings about Elijah, Eliyahu. He's a prophet who heard. He hears the word of the word of the Lord. He runs over to a king that's completely the 7th king of the Israeli territory. His name is Achav. Horrible guy, marries Jezebel. Perhaps you're familiar with all of that. Horrible guy. And this guy shows up out of nowhere. He's called a Tishbite. You even know what a tish is? To bite it. But his name is Hebrew, so maybe we assume he's Hebrew. But he runs and he goes, "It's not going to rain until I say so," and he leaves. That was it. The entire word of the Lord. And then he runs away. Then God says, "All right, now go into this territory because it's going to actually be a drought. There's no rain." And so he goes and he gets fed, and he gets this brook Besodin, and the brook dries up in front of him. And he's like, now what to do? And then he's like, all right, now God says, go to this place and go and meet this widow. And this widow's like, I'm going to bake my last meal and die. And he's like, well, okay, well, make me a cake first. She's like, I'm starving to death. He's like, cool, make me a biscuit, right? The chutzpah. But he does it because God told him. And then after all of that, he's got to go and show down with Achav, right? And he's got to show down with Achav, and he goes and he puts this thing together. Remember, he does the showdown with the 450 prophets of Baal and Ashtoreth, 400 and 450. And then he goes, God, show them that I've done all of this at your word. Every time God said something, he heard and he did it. And he's listening and he's listening. He's not walking by sight, he's walking by faith. And he's listening. He does it all. God, boom, sucks the whole thing up, dries the vat, the water, everything. You'd think this was a fantastic victory. Now it's like, let's go kill those other guys. And why didn't God just take the fire and burn up all of those other false prophets? Because he wanted to show them first he's God so they could receive him before they die. There's something fair about that. Well, anyways, with all of that, and then it says, and then Jezebel goes off. Ladies, you have no idea the power of your words. And she's like, man, I tell you, that guy, may the gods do more, even so more so to me, if that guy isn't like all those prophets. I'm going to kill, he is so dead. And it said something radical, because if you know, because it said, then Elijah runs and hides in a cave. The guy who stood up to the king and the guy who stood up to all the prophets of Baal, now he runs and hides like a sissy in a cave. You know what it says? And when he saw the threat of Jezebel, as long as that guy was listening, he was solid. And can I say the same with you? As long as you are listening in his word and you're listening, you're going to be solid. You start looking around, it's going to throw you. So you remember what God does there? He has these crazy demonstrations. There's this great wind. There's this earthquake, this huge fire. That probably happened with the earthquake. But with all three of those cases, what do we read about God in them? He wasn't in them. I'm sorry? Yeah, it just says that God wasn't in the earthquake, and God wasn't in the fire, God wasn't in the great wind, but it says, but what happened after all that? A still, small voice. Do you realize what God was doing with Elijah? He was getting him back to listening again, because that's where the power was. Does that make sense? Now, the reason I say that is, Elijah was a man like us. He was a man that if he used his eyes, he became a sissy. If he used his ears, he was mighty. And that man, when he listened, he prayed. And when he prayed, the world was changed. And God goes, what, you think he's a superhero? He's like, he's like an avenger among the prophets. And like you're like one of those people in Germany that gets killed by Loki. I mean, is that kind of how that works? He goes, you guys are the same kind of person. He just actually trusted and he prayed. He listened and then he prayed. You should do the same. All right, last two verses.
Brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone turns him back,
let him know that if he returns a sinner from the error of his way, will save the soul from that, and cover a multitude of sins.
Okay, and that's it. Okay, now let me ask you, compared to Paul's letters, what are a couple radically different things you find, for instance, at an end of a letter?
There's no farewell.
There's no, this guy says hi, and this guy says hi, and oh, by the way, Tertullus, he wrote it down for me. He wants to say hi too. I want to say hi to guys, by the way, and hey, how are Priscilla and Aquila doing? Paul's, in the end of it all, Paul was just always like, hey, how's that going? Hey, how's the gout? How's the kids? Somehow in all of that, right? And he's like, oh, hug, big kiss, little kiss. There's like that kind of stuff with Paul. James is like, hey, so you save a guy. Awesome, man. You save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sin. I have nothing more to say. He's like rolling it up. You can see if there's anyone near him, he's like, I say hi. Not important. Just get this out. That's it. There's guys like this. Those kind of guys where you're in a conversation and you're like, wow, that was it. You're done. You're just done. You're just done. I will say, can I boast of this? Not for me, but for people. It says people that hold their tongue. The people that have this gift of holding their tongue to me are some of the people I respect the most. And we have two ridiculously careful speakers in here. And maybe they're introverted, but I'll be honest. It's like when you hang out with Dan and Jaden, but be ready to carry the conversation. But, yes, the girlfriend laughs, But when you tell, it's like people like that tend to wind up with somebody who likes to talk because of. But so great. We're finishing James.
Oh, right. Any more drinks? Are we all good for drinks? Yeah, lemonades. Great.
Thank you. You're awesome. But when it comes to sharing information with a person like that, and you span them for response, and you get, eyes give you, that was all I get, It's cool though, because then there are drummers, That's why I don't know how Daniel could be one, but it's like drummers are usually the first person that they speak and then they think about what they're going to say. But and then you're like, oh, this is embarrassing. And that, I tend to be more of that character. I know that surprises you. And it says, where many words are present, sin is not absent. But he's like, this is a tremendously supernatural thing God speaks about here. Now, as we bring this to close, application, the fundamental, all-encompassing application is, you say you believe in Jesus, which means you've put your trust in him. What is it going to make you do? Or not do? How does it change you? When you're like, well, I gave my life to Jesus when I was 4. Yeah, but did you give your life to Jesus this morning? No, I'm not talking about a salvation issue. Once is enough. You know, I mean, once I stood at the altar with my wife and said, I do, but every morning I wake up and say, I do. Doesn't make me any, well, it does make me more married in my heart, if that makes sense. It doesn't make me unmarried, so to speak. It's just, it makes the marriage better. And what's changing today? What decisions are in front of you that if you trusted God, you'd know there's only one obvious choice? Now, sometimes that's, again, stopping, and sometimes that's doing. There's sin of omission and commission. But I want to pray for that for us. That our faith would lead us to that place where we would actually be like, wow, this is really cool. I'm doing something that if God fails in this situation, I'm such a dead man. You know, but he's not going to fail. And people look and go, and you know, at a moment like that, a reasonably minded individual is going to pull an intervention like Mary did on Jesus with his brothers. And I wonder if James was the one who in John 7 says, why don't you just go show yourself? Thinking he was so wise. Because in the end he goes, you know, that kind of boasting is really stupid and worldly. And I wonder if he's like, believe the guy. Because he strikes me as the kind of guy who could have been that guy. Now look at, isn't faith dangerous? Now I'm not asking you to be presumptuous. Please hear the difference. Faith does not say, I'm jumping, catch me. Faith says, if you call me out of the boat, I will come. Command me, and I'll do it. You know, you already know I don't want to do it. You know that everything inside of me says this is unscientific. Everything inside of me says this doesn't add up. I'm not the guy for this. This doesn't work. But that's why God always needs one Peter in the group. He was the drummer, you know, the guy that's actually willing to step out of the boat. Go, all right, Lord, you just tell me I'll do it. Now, who thought of that? Nowhere Jesus, we don't read anywhere Jesus was like, hey, who wants to come out here with me? And Peter's like, all right, call me by name and I'll do it. It's like Peter comes out of the blue with this, right? Hey, Lord, you're kind of out there on the water. You call me, I'll go too. And you can see the other people going, all right, this ought to be fun to watch. You know? I mean, where is that person? That's like, Lord, if you just called me to do something ridiculous, I would do it. This trip to California that I'd taken, God convicted me of that. Of being like, be willing to do whatever I tell you. Because you will not be sorry in the end for going for it. You're like, well, what if it doesn't work out? Who cares? What does it mean to work out? You obeyed God. You already passed. You already got credit. Stop telling God how it has to work out. Trust him in that. So I want to pray for that for us. Is that fair? And we'll take a moment, we'll get comfy, and then let's worship God. And that's cool. All right, pray with me, would you?